Focusing on the muscles of the pelvis and femoral regions, let's begin with the gluteal muscles, so specifically the gluteus maximus and the gluteus medius muscles. The gluteus maximus is the largest and most superficial muscle of the gluteal group, and it forms a majority of the muscle mass of the buttocks. So this muscle actually functions to extend the thigh. So imagine that you are climbing up some stairs or running, then that's when this muscle is going to be particularly active, is extension of the thigh during those activities. It also laterally rotates and abducts the thigh as well. The gluteus medius is actually deep to the gluteus maximus. You can see a little bit of the muscle showing just superior to the gluteus maximus here. This is an important muscle in steadying the pelvis during walking, and it also serves to abduct and rotate the thigh. So while we're on the posterior part of the thigh here, let's take a look at the hamstrings muscle group. And the hamstrings muscle group is just distal to the gluteal muscles. And this group of muscles contains actually three muscles in total. The biceps femoris muscle, which is the muscle that's located on the lateral part of the posterior thigh. And then the two muscles that are located medially are called the semitendinosus, which is this thin muscle here, and the semimembranosus, which is the broader muscle that's underneath it. So the semimembranosus is deep to the semitendinosus. Now, the semimembranosus is a broad, flat muscle, so I like to associate the semimembranosus with a membrane. So I like to think of, membranes broad and flat. And so that's this muscle right here. So you can see kind of the bulk of the muscle mass here. We can also see a little bit of it in this diagram down kind of at the back part of the knee joint here. So this muscle pretty much occupies this entire medial aspect of the posterior thigh. The semitendinosus is a thin strap-like muscle that is superficial to the semimembranosus. And I like to think of it as more like a tendon, because tendons are thin and strap-like, and so this muscle kind of resembles the thin strap-like tendon qualities. So all of the hamstrings muscles, that is the biceps femoris, the semimembranosus, and the semitendinosus, all cross two joints. So they both cross the hip joint. You can't actually see where they cross the hip joint here because in this diagram, they are the hamstrings muscle group actually runs deep to the gluteus muscle group. And so they cross the hip joint, and they also cross the knee joint as well. So these muscles can produce movement at either the hip joint or the knee joint, depending on how they're contracting. So they serve to extend the thigh. So think of extension of the thigh as returning back to a vertical standing anatomical position. And so the thigh in this diagram is actually extended as this person is standing on their own. So that would be extension of the thigh. That's one of the major actions of this particular muscle group. They also flex the knee as well because they do cross the knee joint. And so think of a flexed knee as winding up to kick a ball, and that's a flexed knee. So that's the hamstrings muscle group on the posterior thigh. Let's turn our attention to the anterior part of the thigh now. Superficially, we see probably the most obvious of the muscles here is this long strap-like muscle that crosses the thigh called the Sartorius muscle. This actually originates on the anterior superior iliac spine, so it actually originates from the hip bones, crosses over the thigh to the medial side, and inserts onto the medial side of the knee joint. So the Sartorius muscle is actually the longest muscle in the body, and from its origin and insertion, you can see that it crosses two joints. It crosses the hip joint, and it also crosses the knee joint as well. So when this muscle contracts, it flexes the thigh, and it also can laterally rotate the thigh as well. Looking at the medial thigh, we have another long, thin, kind of strap-like muscle on the medial side of the thigh. That's called the gracilis muscle here. And because of its position on the thigh, the gracilis muscle, when it contracts, it serves to adduct the thigh or flex the thigh when it contracts. Okay, so let's finish up the muscles of the thigh by looking at the quadriceps femoris muscle group. So this is our last major muscle group for the thigh. It's located on the anterior thigh. As the name quadriceps implies, there are 4 muscles within this group, and these muscles are the rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis, the vastus medialis, and the vastus intermedius. So the rectus femoris muscle is the centrally located superficial muscle. The vastus medialis is on the medial side of the thigh. You can see a little bit of it in this diagram here on the medial side of the thigh, just above the knee joint. The vastus lateralis is more laterally located on the thigh. And the vastus intermedius you can't actually see in this diagram because it's actually deep to the rectus femoris. So all of these muscles originate on the femur with the exception of the rectus femoris muscle. The rectus femoris actually originates from the ilium. So this means that they all cross the anterior side of the knee joint. So all 4 of these muscles cross the anterior side of the knee joint. The vastus muscles do not cross the hip joint, but because the rectus femoris originates from the hip bones, the rectus femoris also crosses the hip joint as well, but none of the vastus muscles actually cross the hip joint because all the vastus muscles originate on the femur, so they do not cross the hip joint in any way. But the thing that unites all 4 of these muscles is that all of them do cross the knee joint on the anterior side. And so when they contract, they cause extension of the knee. So think of extension of the knee as the movement of the knee when you're kicking that ball or something like that, that forward motion of the knee that's accelerating your foot forward to kick the ball, then that's extension of the knee. Also in anatomical position, the knee is extended while we're standing upright. So that's what this muscle group collectively does.